Welcome to the What If It's Not Depression Vodcast. I'm your host, Dr. Achina Stein. And today we are going to be talking about emotional eating. And if you like this episode, please click the like button and subscribe. I am introducing Tricia Nelson, and she is an emotional eating expert and author of the #1 bestselling book, Heal Your Hunger: 7 Simple Steps to End Emotional Eating Now. She herself lost 50 pounds by identifying and healing the underlying causes of her emotional eating. She spent over 30 years researching the hidden causes of the addictive personality. She also certifies health coaches so they can get better results by helping their clients overcoming emotional eating. Tricia is the host of the popular podcast, The Heal Your Hunger Show, and is a highly regarded speaker. She has been featured on NBC, CBS, KTLA, Fox, and Discovery Health, and recently did a wonderful, fantastic TEDx talk on the topic. Welcome, Tricia.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited that you've come to talk about all of this. I have so many patients in my private practice that struggle with emotional eating, and it's definitely top of mind in my discussions with them that is something that they need to address. And it's not just all about food and dieting. And even in my boot camp that has come up, the What If It's Not Depression boot camp, it comes up as a regular topic in our sessions. So I would love for you to just start with, your journey with emotional eating and how it led you to start the Heal Your Hunger movement.
Totally. Yeah. I go way back with emotional eating. I mean, as far back as I can remember, I literally, like at 3 years old, just was loving food, all excited about food. And I love to cook. I love to eat. I love to serve it to other people, go out to dinner, all throughout my childhood. It was like a big highlight. I'd have heart palpitations when like my family was going out to my favorite restaurant. So it was a little bit of an obsession, and that would have been fine. But in adolescence, I started to gain weight, and that was super painful for me. In fact, way even before that time, I thought I was fat. I call that fat head, when you look in the mirror and you think you're fat, even if you're not, so I had that going on. And then I did gain weight in adolescence. I had a big round face, and, I had crazy thoughts because I would try to lose weight and I could do it for a short period of time, but then it would get really hard and I'd go back to my binges. And I was binging from a very, very early age. Actually, my oldest sister was a binger, and she kind of taught me how to binge. When I was in 4th grade, even we went down to Friendly's ice cream, which you're in Rhode Island, so I know you know what that is.
I worked at Friendly's. It was one of my first jobs as a teenager, 16.
You did?
Yes.
Oh my God, I would have loved that. So I would. Basically, to finish that story, she took me down to Friendly's and we each got a packed pint of orange sherbet, and we each got a spoon. It was the first time I'd eaten a pint of ice cream, and I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could just eat a whole pint of ice cream. This is sort of my new foray into binge eating. Thank you very much to my oldest sister. So, yeah. And so I became a binger even at that time. And but, I'd go out to Friendly's with friends, and, growing up, and people would order a sandwich and it would come with French fries, and they would eat their sandwich and pick at their fries. And I'd look at them and be like, how do you leave a French fry on your plate anyway? What is that? And so, cause I'd eat my fries and pick up my sandwich. So anything that was carby and greasy and yummy, I call them ooey gooey, chewy foods. Those are the things I wanted and gravitated towards. And the problem was, starting in adolescence, I started to really pack on pounds. And by age 21, I was 50 pounds overweight. And I, tried many diets, and I tried, speed, over the counter diet pills and all different kinds of stuff. And nothing worked. I mean, I could lose weight for a time, but I always put it back on. And I was a yo-yo dieter. So I was I'd go up 30 pounds, and then I'd go on a diet, lose 20, then I'd gain 10. And, I was all over the place, and I had about 5 different sizes of pants in my closet because I never knew what size I'd be. And I had really violent thoughts towards my body. Like I thought, wow, I have this roll of fat on my tummy. What if it's just fat? You should be able to cut it off like you cut fat off the side of a steak,
Right.
Thank God we didn't try that,
Oh, gosh.
And I had thoughts like, oh, I'd love to get a disease, or I'd automatically lose weight and wouldn't have to diet. So crazy, outlandish thoughts because I was so out of control. Like I couldn't lose the weight and keep it off. And so it was very frustrating to me. And at some point, I just thought, wow, like I've been doing this for a long time. And not only just the diets, but I graduated from diets to like psychological things. So I'd read self-help books. I went to therapy. I literally went to an eating disorders therapist for a whole year, twice a week, and still nothing, like the needle really didn't move. I went to 12-step programs. So I did a lot of different things, but, nothing really lasted for me. And I always ended up in the same place where I started or worse. Right. And so I got to this point of real hopelessness where I felt like, wow, like, is this going to be my life going up and down the scale? Like, especially when I'm trying so hard. I mean, one thing I'm like, screw it. I'm just going to eat bonbons every day and watch TV. Like, no, I was really trying and not overeating most of the time, but I would break out in these binges and then blow everything I just accomplished. So it was really frustrating. And what happened for me is I met somebody who had been obese and lost the weight by going deeper and dealing with the underlying causes. And this person mentored me. And it changed everything for me. Like I was finally able to really lose the weight and keep it off. And, then I started, he and I worked together to help other people for many years. And more recently, 5 years ago, I started Heal Your Hunger to help people all over the world through online Zoom and, online modules and that kind of thing, because it's just, what I did is I really created a step-by-step process based on what I did to heal. And it's just made it so much easier for people to follow it and really start to dig under, to the underlying causes without like 20 years of therapy or something like that. Like I've really sped up the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the key words there are finding the underlying causes. That's
Amen.
really, really key.
Yes.
And a lot of times people are not in touch with those underlying causes. And, what we're going to speak about is the emotional causes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And, I have people say to me all the time, like, they're like, oh, I know why I eat. It's because my dad was an alcoholic or my mom left us or whatever. And, they're right in going back to trauma, but the problem is it's not one isolated thing. It's, you can't just like go to therapy, take care of that issue and you're back on track. What happens as kids is we do have trauma. It's very typical for people who struggle chronically with food and weight to have some kind of dysfunction in their childhood. It's hard for anybody not to have dysfunction in their childhood, but basically, it's not one isolated thing, because what happens is that you have, stress and trauma as a kid with very few coping tools that you can reach out for. When you're a kid, you don't have a lot of options. So food is right there. Thank God. Thank God we had food, to kind of soften the edges of the pain we were in. But we also have at our fingertips only, besides food, it's very few other options, but we can sort of morph our behavior, become chameleons to survive whatever it is we're going through. Kids are super adaptive. And so we do that. We have these survival skills. So what happens is we have the trauma, and then we have these various survival skills that help us deal with that trauma. And those survival skills save our life in some instances.
Absolutely.
But then we bring them into our adulthood, and then they backfire on us and start to really ruin our lives. And a good example of that is like people pleasing. So as a kid, if you have alcoholism in your family, you better be a people pleaser. Like you better, especially if you're a rager, perhaps you have a rageaholic in your family, you better be really good at being a chameleon and making sure you get in this habit of try to mitigate the adult's behavior by, turning colors, and making sure that you don't piss somebody off. And so it works as a kid, but as an adult, when we're people pleasers, we're taking on so much more stress, we're doing other people's jobs. We're always trying to get the added girls, we're trying to get approval, validation from outside ourselves. And it's this whole web of personality traits like people pleasing, but it's no longer one isolated thing. So when people say, I know why I eat, I think and often say, you probably don't know you only know the half of it. There's so many different personality traits that we use to get by in life. And those have to be addressed, and they have nothing to do with food, but they drive our eating.
Exactly. Yeah. And they're usually talking about events that they are connecting with on a cognitive level.
Yeah.
They're not really seeing how those events transpire on a day-to-day emotional level, how it's driven on an emotional level.
Yes.
Really tapping into that. That's really important. And so what you're also talking about is the parts of you. There are parts of you, and there's probably more than just the pleaser. There's the peacekeeper. There's all sorts of parts of you that will, this is in keeping with IFS therapy or internal family systems therapy, where there are parts of you that worked really well as a child to survive, like you said, but then they continue to do the same thing as you grow up, and they don't even realize that you've grown up. So it's really connecting to those parts of you, engaging with them and on an emotional level, not just, oh yeah, okay, I recognize that part, but then how do you engage with it? Those are really, really important to understand. And it's really the emotional change that needs to happen, not just the talk about it.
No question. And it's not conscious. I mean, it's so subconscious, and that's why we have to go deeper. That's why there's a lot of, tools that we can use to try to change our subconscious, because on a conscious level, you can know how to be different. But when it's so deeply ingrained in us and we've been practicing these habits for so long, that's where the self-sabotage comes in. I mean, most people who struggle with food and weight are not ignorant about nutrition. Like, they've read enough books. They've been working on trying to figure themselves out for a long time, trying all these different kinds of diets. They know what to eat, but they can't follow through on what they know. And that's so frustrating. It's like, I'm not stupid. Like, I know what to eat, but I don't do it when push comes to shove, and that's incredibly frustrating. And so it's just really important to know that the self-sabotage does come from those subconscious, ways of being that we're not even tuned into. And frankly, a lot of people aren't even tuned into the fact that they do emotionally eat, because, I have people tell me like, oh, I didn't even realize emotional eating was a thing. I thought I just liked food. And that's what I thought too. When I first heard emotional eating, I thought, that's really stupid. I don't do that. Like that. I don't do that. But the thing is food works really well. And if food is working to cover up your emotions, of course, you're not going to be in touch with the fact that you're emotionally eating, because you don't feel those emotions. It's working, Right. And so it's really a whole new concept for people to realize that, oh yeah, because you don't think, oh, I'm going to numb my feelings now with chocolate. You think, oh man, I could really use some chocolate. That looks so good, or you're at a party, like, I want the cake. And so you're not connected to the emotional underpinnings of why you're feeling the need to eat. So it's like a new muscle that you have to exercise to start really doing that sleuthing work.
Right. So, why don't we just be really clear, just so people get what you're talking about? What is your definition of emotional eating?
Yeah, I mean, it's very simple. It's using food beyond nutritional need. Like, it's using food for reasons that are emotional, and it's really to numb emotions, to really just feel no pain, and so that's it. I mean, and again, it doesn't have to be conscious. Like, here I am about to kill my feelings. It's like, cravings can feel like they're like they just strike, like we're just sort of struck with cravings. But again, with some self-awareness and self-care, you can start to realize, oh, wow, like there is a connection between my emotions and my eating. And I'm happy to dig into that a little bit and talk about the 3 primary emotions that drive emotional eating.
Yeah. Why don't you do that right now? Yeah.
Okay. So it's something I call the PEP test. And PEP is an acronym, PEP. And it basically is a way for people to start making that connection. And there's lots of emotions, but I've really identified through my research 3 primary emotions. And, we know what unhealthy foods do to us, but this is a way to see what it's doing for us. Like how is this food serving us? So the first P in PEP stands for painkiller, because we're trying to numb or anesthetize uncomfortable, painful feelings, because there's a lot of them, right. Life is not easy. We have children that are dysregulated or, get hurt. We have parents that are dying. We have, jobs that don't fit us anymore, a relationship that's ending. There's like countless numbers of ways that we can feel emotional pain. But typically as emotional eaters, we've decided at some point in our life that we didn't want to feel emotional pain. Like we just want the happy high notes, and so the painful feelings, we soften those feelings. We sort of soften the edges of painful feelings with carbs, with sugar, with high calorie foods, because they work. Like in the moment, you eat some chips or some ice cream and cookies, you will not feel anything. Like you'll be like blissed out. And, but of course it's incredibly temporary. Right. And so you have to feel the feelings again, which means you eat again, which is why it's such a vicious, addictive cycle. So that's the first way that we reach for food, is to kill uncomfortable, painful feelings. Mm-hmm. The second, which is the E in PEP, stands for escape. And this is really, emotional eaters tend to be super responsible, super good doobies. We want to be, again, people pleasers. We want to be well thought of, get the atta girls. And so, at the end of the day, we're exhausted from all our good behavior. But we also have a lot of fear. Like overeaters tend to be over thinkers and feelers. And so we feel, a lot, and we worry a lot. We tend to worry and awfulize and have worst case scenarios going through our head. And sometimes we just want to get out of our heads. Like sometimes we just want to check out. So food is a great form of escape. Like I used to get my binge foods and sit in front of the TV. They went together like peanut butter and jelly, and so that was another way that I used food, was just to check out of being super responsible and doing a lot of worrying and fretting and taking on other people's problems and so forth. The last P in PEP stands for punishment. And this one's counterintuitive. Like you wouldn't think of this because we think of food as a reward. But, if we're somebody who goes overboard regularly, like we mean to eat just a few, cookies, but we end up eating the whole bag, or a few Hershey's Kisses, but we eat all of them, and then we feel sick. It's like, wait a minute, that is not a reward. I've just totally made myself feel sick. What's up with that? And my experience is when we're over feelers, we tend to feel guilty about everything. Emotional eaters are so hard on themselves. Like we tend to be perfectionistic, and hold ourselves to a very high, impossible standard. And so we constantly feel disappointed and mad at ourselves. And we are also really hard on ourselves when we make mistakes. And so basically that drives our need to just sort of beat the crap out of ourselves. And eating unhealthy foods in large amounts is a great way to feel sick and mad at yourself. Like it works like a charm, And so these 3 things in the PEP test is painkiller, escape, and punishment. These, I offer that up, the PEP test, as a way for people to start making the connection. Like if you think you just like food, start like when you go to the refrigerator I used to go to the refrigerator like 5 times of an evening. Like I was isn't there anything new there? Like what happened? Like somebody plant some food in my fridge, because I was always feeling unfulfilled. And so when you start to do that, often check in and say, what's really going on? Like what is happening here? And that can really help.
Right. So what would you say is, and that's fantastic. Thank you for offering those 3 reasons. And you're right that the punishment piece is counterintuitive, and that people don't necessarily think of that piece of it. So that's a great addition that I didn't even think of. So I learned something from you, but I see it in action now that you've described it. I see it in action over and over again with some of my patients. Yeah. So tell me what's the difference between, so people understand the difference between an emotional eater and a food addict.
Sure. Yeah. My experience, Achina, is that it's really a spectrum. Okay. So I think, and I like to just indict everybody so there's no question, I think we're all emotional eaters. I think we're all hardwired to have an emotional connection with food. And I mean, think of a mother breastfeeding her child. Like, it's a beautiful emotional connection, bonding experience. So we have it in us to get this comfort from food. It's just that some people take it way too far. And that was me. So in the low end of the spectrum is emotional eating, just kind of baseline. And the high end of the spectrum is food addiction. And what qualifies where somebody is on that spectrum are two things. The first is the level of control they have. So let's say you go on a cruise, you drink too much, wine and eat a bunch of cheese and crackers and desserts. You gain 5 pounds in like the 10-day cruise. You come back, you're like, whoa, got a little extra weight on me, feeling uncomfortable. I'm going to jog extra and cut out sweets. And boom, the 5 pounds are off. So first of all, they have control where they can course correct. Okay. And then they have very few consequences. 5 pounds that you can take off like that, not a lot of consequences. Versus somebody on the high end of the spectrum, which is where I was, which is really food addiction. This is basically, when we go down the rabbit hole with food. So we have a binge and then we feel really like we're doing good for a while. I cannot tell you how many times I heard I was doing good until the pandemic hit. So some emotional event, a death, loss of a job, whatever, some big thing happens. And then it's like we turn to food as our coping mechanism. And then we go down this dark rabbit hole where we just keep going and can't pull back, can't course correct. That's somebody who's more of a food addict, where food is their solution. Like, food's what they turn to for all life's ills, and so it's a constant fight and struggle, and there's very little control and there's a whole lot of consequences when somebody's been doing this for a long time. That yo-yo roller coaster ride, if somebody's on that enough, over decades, which is usually what it is, because people try diets time and time again, even though 98% of all diets fail statistically, we'll keep at it because we sort of have this amnesia where we forget all the diets we tried and failed. Well, it makes sense. Like, your pants are too tight, go on a diet. And so we just sort of fall into that pattern. But if you do that over and over for decades, you're going to have joint pain. You're going to be pre-diabetic, if not diabetic. There's all kinds of, autoimmune issues, gut issues. I mean, all the things you see with your patients. And that comes from years of beating ourselves up with food, eating crappy foods in large amounts, and being out of control with our weight. So that's where somebody's on the high end of the spectrum. And I actually have a quiz on my website that somebody can take. It's a free quiz, which will tell you exactly where you are in that spectrum. And you get a personalized score.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
I have that in the show notes, everybody. So, I actually had a patient recently who completed my intake, and on the intake is night eating syndrome. And it was the first time she had ever heard of that. So I would love for you to just talk about that from your perspective and what that is, and to clue people into how is that connected to what you do?
Yeah, totally. It's very common. I've surveyed many emotional eaters, and 75% of them say that they have struggled with, eating in the afternoon into the night. Okay. So that's their hardest time in the morning. And it makes sense. Like, we have more willpower first thing in the morning, and the willpower just drops, as the day goes on, but also the stress rises as the day goes on. So in the morning, we don't have a lot of stress, but as the day goes on and we're answering phone calls, we're doing work, we're, driving the kids around, we're adding, we're piling on stress. So at the end of the day, we have this huge amount of stress and very few ways to deal with the stress besides eating. And that's when it gets really hard around food. Plus, in my experience as an emotional eater, in the nighttime, when things get quiet, that's when, we start to get present with all the emotions we didn't deal with. And so when somebody hurt our feelings and we kind of just blew it off because we were busy and we had a job to do, or, somebody said something that we're like, what was that anyway? Or what was that hard conversation that took place, or that really bad news that we got? All that stuff comes when you're busy and you've got the stress and the adrenaline rush of getting things done, your emotions are at bay. Like, you're not clued into your emotions. You're on automatic pilot. But at the end of the day, when the kids have gone to bed, and it's just you and you're in the kitchen, all that stuff comes bubbling to the surface. And if you don't have healthy tools for dealing with it, you're just going to shove it down with food. It's going to drive you to the refrigerator. And to me, that's why nighttime eating is a thing, is that we've left our emotions unaddressed throughout the day, and they're coming to the surface and we don't know what to do with them. So we're just going to, it shows up as cravings, and we just answer those cravings with food.
Right. Yeah. And it's also the same drivers that cause people to not sleep at night too.
Yes. Stress.
Yeah. So like you said, all of those thoughts and feelings are at bay during the day because you're busy. And as soon as you stop and you're trying to sleep, all of these thoughts and feelings come rushing at you. And it's just not having the coping skills to be able to handle those emotions, and it's learning how to do that. And when you're able to do that and process those emotions, then your sleep gets better. That's one of the drivers. But, one thing I just want to mention so that the audience knows, and because I was talking to a patient about that, is that food represents mother and love, nurturing. It represents those things in your life, and it's connection. And we typically use food to connect with people around a table, right? So it represents so many things that if you have issues with a particular parent, or connecting with people, you're going to connect to the food and get that nurturing, self-nurturing in an unhealthy fashion. Right?
No question.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So it's interesting that there's lots of layers that need to be addressed, and you're addressing them through the emotional underpinnings of food.
Yeah. And also, in terms of a solution, so much of what I teach is very practical, because we can easily get in our head with trying to figure it all out. Mm-hmm. But we can know a lot and not have it, play out in our experience. So in terms of really changing this pattern, my experience is, I tell my clients often, we act our way into right thinking instead of thinking our way into right action, which gives people something practical to do. So the self-care piece and bringing down our stress and having ways to start processing our emotions through writing and journaling, meditation through, trying to de-stress through meditation, setting boundaries on our time. There's lots of practical things people can do to start really changing this habit. And I find that really helpful because, again, we want to get in our head about it, but our head is not where we're really gonna make changes, practical changes in our life. Right. So I think that's really hopeful for people, is you don't have to figure it all out. First of all, I've kind of laid out a lot of the major pitfalls for people. Like when I was talking about the people pleasing, there are so many traits that have nothing to do with food. And I have something called the anatomy of the emotional eater. And there's 24 traits actually that we fall into. So just knowing what those are really helps people identify the problem very quickly. So they don't have to spend a lot of time, again, trying to figure it all out over years.
Oh, that's fantastic. So is that part of the quiz that you mentioned earlier, or is this something different?
It's in my book, for one thing, the anatomy of the emotional eater and the 24 traits. It's a whole chapter in my book, Heal Your Hunger, but also in my programs. So in my 90-day program, there's a whole module on the traits and what they look like, how they play out in your life, and then exercises on how to start turning those around. Because again, you can change your eating. And this is why diets are ineffective, because you can like change your eating, but if you don't change how you got there in the first place, which really comes from how we show up in life, like going back to the people pleasing, when we people please and we take on extra stress, which affects our, cortisol, and hormones, when we do that, basically people pleasing, it's like we create a lot of stress from people pleasing, but then we also create resentment, which is one of the other traits of the anatomy of the emotional eater. Emotional eaters are very resentful, because we people please for so long. So the combination of the people pleasing and the resentment, it justifies an I deserve it binge. Right. Which is, it's like, we don't just binge, like we're driven by these unconscious emotions. But the good news is we can change it by how we behave, so it's like we can stop people pleasing, or at least curb our people pleasing, or at least say, let me get back to you instead of yes every time we're asked to do something. Like just create like a pause so you can check in with yourself. Do I really want to go to that party, or do I really want to take on that project? Can I really afford the stress of that or the time commitment of that? And asking those questions is so important. And this is how we live our way into, or act our way into right thinking. And I also, another way I put it is it's a living problem, not an eating problem.
Right. So I would imagine that in your programs, you talk about learning how to say no, in role modeling about how to do that.
Big time.
Assert yourself.
Yes. It's such an Achilles heel for emotional eaters. We unfortunately, when we didn't get a strong sense of ourselves growing up, which I didn't, I lived for validation. I lived for people to think I was fabulous, because that fed me, but it was from the outside in. And so we have to start living from the inside out. And communication is a big Achilles heel for people, because we're just so, we eat our words. Like we don't say what we really feel. We just stuff it with food,
Right.
Yeah. So absolutely. So like, that's a big part of it, is starting to communicate more effectively, not being passive aggressive, starting to really say how we feel or what we need. It's a big deal for us, when we're so afraid of what the ramifications will be and losing other people's favor, which really doesn't happen. It's just, and we imagine will happen. And when we've depended so much on being liked and adored, it's a big step, but that's a lot of how the changing happens, is just by really knowing ourselves better and standing for who we are, which is a wonderful, beautiful lesson. It needs to be learned at some point in our lives. Why not now?
Exactly. And a lot of times people confuse asserting oneself with aggression, and it's not the same thing. And you mentioned passive aggressive. So that's jumping from passive to aggression and back and forth, but not being in the middle where you're asking for what you need in a kind, compassionate way. Right?
Yes.
And so it's being assertive. So being assertive is asking for what you need in a kind, compassionate way. And that's something that takes practice. And it does take courage to take that first step by starting with little things, low-hanging fruit, and working up to the more difficult conversations that where there might be, some fallout, real fallout.
Yeah.
So it is learning those skills. Absolutely. It's so important to learn how to be assertive. And that's something that I talk quite a bit about with my patients as well.
Yep. I call it say what you mean what you say, and don't say it mean.
I love that. That's great. Yeah. Wow. Perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. So, I know you've mentioned a couple times that, 98% of all diets fail. And would you say that this was the main reason, the emotional eating, or do you think there's other reasons as well?
I think it's 100% the emotional eating piece is so overlooked. Right. Like we always we think the more we know about nutrition, we think the more we, the next diet that comes along, it's the intermittent fasting. No, it's the keto. No, it's the vegan. It's like, that stuff isn't really what's going to move the needle, and there's always going to be a new something to follow. but it's really, the eating between meals, the snacky foods that we eat, and the emotional connection we have with food. If we can't bear to feel our feelings, we have to eat a lot over, in a continuous way so that we don't feel. And honestly, so much of it comes down to learning how to be present with ourselves and with our feelings. And we just don't learn that. It's kind of an escapist nation that we're in here, where we're constantly, whether it's social media or music or, Facebook or whatever, we're constantly checked out, multitasking, and we don't know how to be with ourselves. And again, for emotional eaters, especially when we, at an early age, when it wasn't safe to be with your feelings, like the feelings were so intense and you had no frame of reference for how to be with that, it's becomes like a deadly habit, like to escape ourselves and our feelings. So I think there's so much unconscious eating happening, and it's not just as simple as I like food. I mean, yeah, I do like food. Food's great, and I still enjoy my meals. I don't feel deprived. But at the end of the day, it's metabolizing feelings, and really being able to just be with ourselves without, any kind of distraction. That is, that's a thing, that's a muscle that we have very little experience with building. And I think that is why people, it's certainly regarding the diets, especially if you think about it, when you take food away, like your favorite foods away, and that's your primary means of coping, of course you're going to go back to the food, because you're like, whoa, like, how do I deal with this stress? How do I deal with that stress? You feel naked, and you're like, you want to run for cover. After you're over the kind of general excitement, the initial excitement of going on a diet or eating a new, food plan, it's fun at first. You have a little adrenaline rush. It's like the new diet syndrome. But then after that, things go flat and you're like, whoa, like life's a little too hard for me. I need to have some buffer between me and the harsh realities of life. And that's where food comes back into our life.
Right. And so this needs to be a gradual change, or being aware that that's what's happening. That's really important. Yeah.
Yes.
So, and you mentioned, being present with your feelings, but it's also being present with your food too, because so many times people just vacuum down their food. Yeah. They're not really connecting to the actual food and enjoying it in a different way. Right.
No question. Really getting present and mindful is so important.
So, so you mentioned cravings, that people have cravings for food, but there's also hunger. Sometimes people, when they're on these diets, they're hungry all of the time. And I know that that's probably something that you encounter as well. And it's not just cravings. Do you find that there is a connection between emotions and physical hunger, or are they different?
Well, I'm always amazed. I mean, I've been on this road for over 30 years doing this work. And I am always amazed at how I can be sitting at my computer with something I know I have to deal with that I don't want to deal with. And all of a sudden I feel very hungry. And so I'm like, I have to have a conversation with myself. Like, I'm like, all of a sudden think to myself, I'm so hungry, and then I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And the reason why I can pretty easily tell if it's physical or emotional is in part because I recommend something and practice something which I call 3-meal magic, which is eating 3 meals with nothing in between. It's like, and you can, if you're into intermittent fasting, you can do 12 hours between your dinner and your breakfast, but going a long period of time and having kind of a roller coaster ride of hunger and eating, to me, is unstabling and unstabilizing perhaps. And if you eat 3 meals and put 4 or 5 hours in between each meal, besides the difference between dinner, the space between dinner and breakfast, I find that it's very stabilizing. It's very grounding. But more than that, you can do the sleuthing work more easily and say, like, it's 10 a.m. Are you really starving, Tricia? Like, really, at 7, you had a really good breakfast. You're going to eat at 12. You're probably not starving, and then you can go the next step, which is what's really going on. Oh, You have to do your taxes. Oh, maybe that's making you feel hungry, because it's like the thing I most hate to do. So it's really amazing how
hate to do their taxes.
right. Yeah. And so it's really amazing how it can feel like physical hunger. But, that's why this self-awareness is so important, and the regular, really a regular schedule of eating, so that you aren't on these wild rides, with hunger that's physical. You can better kind of suss out what's going on. And I think it's just, so grounding to do that. And so self-caring, first of all, to eat on a regular schedule, how do you feed your kids? Do you have your kids fast for 16 hours because they might lose a few pounds? Like, no, probably not. So think about what's the most caring, self-loving way you can eat. And again, I know there's science for intermittent fasting, and I don't mean to be talking, about intermittent fasting in a negative way. I have to filter diet, nutritional and diet information through the lens of being an emotional eater. I have to take that into account, because emotional eaters aren't like other eaters. And even though the science may be there, if you're going on a wild ride of start like feeling hungry for too long, you'll send off these alarms. If food saved our life as children, as kids, in traumatic situations, if food was our, kind of how we coped, to go too long without food as an adult, send off these very primitive alarms of, I'm going to die. Like, I'm going to die if I don't eat. And that's how we end up binging when we open up the window, and that's why it's not recommended, intermittent fasting, because, we have to take a more self-compassionate, approach to eating, where we treat ourselves like we would treat our sweet daughter, like how would we have our sweet daughter eat? That's how we have to treat ourselves, not with harsh, different trips with food. I think it's really important, especially because as emotional eaters, we've done so many harsh diets. We've already put ourselves through such paces trying to lose weight, such harsh, crazy things that we've done with food and weight, that it's time to just come back home and treat ourselves with a lot of love.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So why don't we wrap up by maybe giving our listeners 3 ways that they can get started on this journey about emotional eating? I know you mentioned some things in passing, but why don't we just encapsulate it right here, but what a person can do to end emotional eating now? What can they do?
So I would say the first thing to do, because overeaters tend to be overdoers, and we've talked about this, I would say, look at your schedule and see where you can schedule some self-care. Slowing down, especially first thing in the morning, not just popping out of bed and, doing Instagram, Facebook, phone calls. Like, give yourself a little ritual in the morning. Talk about self-care. Like, it's really sweet to have a little morning routine, either meditation and prayer, spiritual readings, a walk in nature, things that can get you connected to yourself, and to your higher self. Like, this is just going to be so grounding. And I call it putting money in your spiritual bank account, because later in the day, when stress piles up, we need to make withdrawals. But if we haven't put anything in the bank account, we'll be on empty, and we'll be reaching for food, And so it's really important to sort of, put deposits in the bank that you can draw on later in the day. That's really sweet. And plus it's a beginning of starting to connect with ourselves, and be a source, that we can draw on. So I'd say that's really important. Also, getting off the diet track, like, as sexy as it is to start another diet, resist the temptation, because it's so much more, the most sustainable thing you can do is just start the self-care habits and not make it about the food, and I tell people over and over, it's not about the food. Like, you're not hungry for food. When you feel like you are, we are hungry for connection. You mentioned earlier, connection, community. And that brings me to my last thing, and that's that we have to do this in community. And my experience as emotional eaters, we need other emotional eaters to support us and hold us accountable. And it's hard for people to recognize they need community because there's so much shame around our eating habits. And we're like, we should ourselves to death. Like, I should be able to do this on my own. What's wrong with me? It's just, what I'm putting in my mouth, like how silly that I would need help with that. But what people don't understand then is this is one of the most addictive habits there is. Like you have to eat. You can't, it's not like alcohol where you can put the plug in the jug. Like you have to eat,
right.
And so it's not easy. It's a fine line that you're walking. So of course you're going to need support. And
right.
people don't think twice about, getting accountability with working out at the gym. Like they're like clear, they're not going to work out as hard if they don't have somebody standing there supporting them,
right.
So why are we giving ourselves a hard time about getting support with our eating? There's just so much head noise around it, so much shame and self-berating, And so, but I will tell you, put away the mallet. Like, yeah, I need support. I still get support. Like I still have my community of emotional eaters, that I reach out to for support because I'm not cured. I'm still an emotional eater and I have to make sure I am walking this path as well. So I just would give people really encouragement to get community and to realize that you can't do this alone.
Yeah. And believe it or not, people don't realize that there's actually is a community that people can join nationwide, and it's Overeaters Anonymous. Right. So it's just,
I'll just say
anonymous, but there's Overeaters Anonymous. And do you have an opinion about that?
Well, I only in that I started in OA and I was an OA dropout. So I wholeheartedly, it's free. It's definitely a great place, to reach out to. It's different around the country. There's different, levels of support and accountability, rigidity around food. There's lots of different kind of flavors of it. Mm-hmm. So the reason why I started my program is because I was an OA dropout and couldn't get what I needed there. So it doesn't work for everybody. Right, It doesn't work for everybody. Some people need more structure and more help around the underlying, really overcoming the underlying causes. So in my personal program, I created community within my program for that very reason, because I know it's vital, and I recommend community, and there's no way you can do it without it. And those 12-step programs are a free resource, and I think that's awesome. I just know for myself, because the only reason I have Heal Your Hunger is because I couldn't make it in OA.
Right. Yeah, well, it's great to have multiple programs, and it's important for people to know that it's out there. I've had a couple patients who have done really well with Overeaters Anonymous or OA. And I think it is something that people can try, and just being aware that it's there and that your program is there is great. You're absolutely right about community. I mean, it's the reason why I created the boot camp, because it is a group online program. And it's really the community that gets people motivated. It's accountability, but it gets people motivated to do the things that they need to do, because, finding root causes of depression and then doing something about it, which is dietary and lifestyle changes, are all habits that have to be put in place. And
no question. People have to find what works for them. It's not a one size fits all issue. It's a whole journey that people are on. So you have to find where you feel comfortable and where you get the most, support.
Yeah, great. So I'm so thankful that you have come to share your knowledge about, emotionally eating and healing. I really appreciate everything that you've offered to us. And thank you so much for joining us today. Really.
I'm so glad you had me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for all you do.
Great. Thank you.